Welcome to our program, Colonel Sweet and Mark Toth.
Hey, Daniel, thanks for having us back on. I appreciate the opportunity.
Great to be here, Daniel. Thank you.
Donald Trump beats Kamala Harris. Also, Republicans gained the majority in Senate, and they are on their way to gain majority in the House of Representatives. I would like to start with you, Mark. What is your reaction to the results of the U.S. general election, and did it impress you?
Daniel, I'm not surprised at the outcome. I think for those of us, especially since I'm an economist by background, you could tell that the economy was the number one issue for people. And it wasn't about inflation, as people had talked about in terms of what it is today, roughly 2.1%. It was more about affordability. And there are a lot of working class Americans that Trump was able to garner in this election win that simply didn't have enough income. Income hadn't kept up with the inflation rate, the cumulative effects, if you will, of inflation over the last 4 years. And I think that's what fueled it. So I'm not surprised by it. It certainly was a significant victory. When you look at it, not only does it appear that he won the Senate, he looks like he's on course to win the House. It looks like he's also going to win the popular vote, which no Republican president has done since George W. Bush did that in the early 2000s. So I think that this definitely is a wave, given that the margin of the winning percentage came across the what had been the blue wall states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. You might call it a wavelet, but I think it's more than that. It's somewhere between a wavelet and a wave, because you're winning by 75 to 100,000 margins in each of those states. So I think this was very much a election that was decided upon on domestic issues, and that we shouldn't conflate that decision in terms of what Americans in general were saying about foreign policy, Ukraine, China, etc.
It's a landslide victory of Donald Trump. Does it mean that economy played a key role in this?
Right. Just as I said, I think, especially to your viewers in Ukraine, I think it's important to understand what this election was around. And it really was, Daniel, as I was mentioning in my first answer, but in terms of your follow-up, it really was an election that economics drove it. And I think that's important, because I think we still have time to make the case for Ukraine, why this war, Putin's against not just Ukraine, but the West, must be won, and that we must not give up this fight. I realize it's going to cause a lot of anxiety in Ukraine, rightly so. It's going to cause a lot of anxiety between those of us who strongly believe in NATO and believe in winning this fight in Ukraine. But all is not lost yet. I think it's important for all of us to stay positive, stay focused, and to make the case for why Ukraine has to win this war, and to make the case for why Ukraine has not just been fighting this war for its own survival, but on behalf of Western liberty.
Do you expect Donald Trump to halt supply of weapons to Ukraine? And what are the possible scenarios on Ukraine by Donald Trump? What are his options right now? And what kind of plan he can choose on Ukraine?
Yeah, I think I'd caution again, you're going to see Trump posturing a lot with those kind of statements, withholding stuff, a carrot and a stick kind of approach. We're not going to know until we know who his Secretary of State is. We're not going to know that until we know who his Secretary of Defense are and whose National Security Advisor are, and the kind of tactics that he takes. He might do that. It's possible. He's hinted at that in statements that he's made. We just don't know. The bluster of a political campaign in the U.S. doesn't always tend to follow through in terms of what you see after a president begins governing. Very rarely do campaign promises translate into legislative aspects or even governance coming out of the White House. So that aspect is out. I can let John kind of get more into the details in terms of what he thinks that looks like from a military standpoint.
Sure, John. What is your take on the military standpoint of this question, and what do you personally expect from Donald Trump to do regarding Ukraine, on Ukraine strategy?
Look, I agree with everything that Mark just said concerning the outcome of the election, what it means, and how we need to separate foreign policy from domestic issues. I think we have to hold our horses just a little bit. The difference between a political candidate and a president are the intelligence that's going to be presented to soon to be President Trump on what's going on both in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East and elsewhere. They'll make decisions based upon intelligence. So I'm confident in that. I'm also confident that he's going to surround himself with advisors. And again, as Mark said, we have not seen or heard who his Secretary of Defense is going to be, who Secretary of State is going to be, his national security advisor. So we don't necessarily know the direction in which he may lean towards, other than what he has said on the campaign trail. And let's not mistake, what his vice president has said, Vance, because it has been in some cases particularly harsh and critical of Ukraine, but not necessarily what the president or the future president has subscribed to. So there's going to be some thinking going on between now and the time in which they assume office. And when I think we'll start seeing the shaping of a policy towards Ukraine and the Middle East and China, but we're going to see that in the upcoming months. So I would say let's not get too far out front. What we should be thinking about right now is what the Biden administration can be doing in the next 60 to 90 days, because he's only committed 10% of the funds allocated to him by Congress. Okay, he still has the additional 90% of the funds he can allocate. He can also release authorities for Ukraine to do precision deep strikes in Russia to eliminate or to defeat the Russian threat and the North Korean threat before it arrives in Ukraine. So we still have the Biden administration that has a role, and we have the Trump administration that will play a closing role in this.
You just mentioned about the North Korean troops in Russia and Ukraine. North Korean engaged in a combat in the Kursk region for the first time, according to Reuters. What does it mean, John? And how should the West respond to this? And do you expect North Koreans to play significant role in this war?
I believe that the North Koreans are going to be used to fill in holes within the Russian military. So we're seeing that now. They're putting those forces in areas in which the Russian military right now is at a disadvantage. And one of those is in the Kursk region, obviously, as the Ukrainian military continues its drive inward, but also supporting, I believe, we haven't seen them in Ukraine yet. We've just seen them in Russia. So they're filling roles. It's difficult to get a good grasp on exactly what the plan is, quite frankly, because that intelligence is being withheld, closely by the United States and by NATO as they're trying to come up with some sort of posturing or some sort of reaction to this. I believe the Secretary General for NATO has spoken about this. He understands the threat. My concern right now is that as those Korean forces are there and they are actually engaging in combat operations, is that this could open up Pandora's box to other nations committing troops. And that's certainly not where we want to be. I think the better place to be is posturing and messaging to Russia by, one, authorizing Ukraine the ability to use those precision deep strike capabilities, and telling the Russian government that if you don't withdraw those soldiers from areas, or if their North Koreans aren't withdrawn back to a certain area, that we will authorize the Ukraine to use those weapons. So it is messaging right now, but at the end of the day, it poses a significant threat. It's 10 to 12,000 now. It could easily be another 10 to 12 to 15,000 later, which is exactly what Putin needs because of the inexperience in the military he has fielded in both the Kursk region and the Donbass.
And what is your take on that, Mark? And how can Donald Trump deal with this issue of North Korean troops deployed to Russia in Ukraine? And can Donald Trump be tough on Putin?
Daniel, that's going to be the $1 million question that we see answered come January. I think he can. I think it's important to remember that only now the transition begins. Trump's going to get a whole new level of detail when it comes to the intel that he's not had access to up until this point. There's a transition process where he's going to get a much greater level of information that he's had to date. He's had some as the nominee that's traditionally given, but now it's going to go to a whole new level. And he's going to start to see exactly what those troop movements are in North Korea, what the U.S. intel estimates are of them. He's going to also see to a greater detail, for instance, this DHL plot, the incendiary devices that were exploded over the summer Birmingham in England, and Leipzig in Germany, and also in Poland, just to the north of you. There was another one at a DHL facility. He's going to see all of that, and he's going to see more Putin's fingerprints that we've been warning about. And hopefully that fuels him to realizing that Putin's war, as I mentioned earlier at the start of our interview here, is not just against Ukraine, it's against the West. And hopefully as Trump gets to see that and he starts to formulate a picture of just how wide scale Putin's war is, he'll show the resolve to say, no, this can't stand. And that if I lose Ukraine, it's going to be similar in disaster to what the hasty withdrawal of U.S. troops was in Afghanistan.
And Mark, how can you assess the influence of Trump's inner circle on his decision-making process? Who can take the lead in advising Trump on Ukraine? National security advisors, professionals, national security professionals, or some of his closest allies, friends?
Daniel, it's a fair question, but I think we have to look at who Trump is as a man. He's his own man. I think if you've ever had someone that signifies someone that's really takes his own counsel, it's Trump. I think those around him at best, based on his first administration, just based on his modus operandi, they at best, in my mind, can put brakes on him. That's certainly what happened in his first administration. I think the kind of choices he's likely to make, he may not get those. It may take more of a forcible argument coming out of his sec def, his sec state, whoever those people might end up being, to try to influence him. Now, he's a smart guy, and I'm not saying that as someone who politically supports him. I'm apolitical. I think he realizes that he had missteps the first time out, and he needs to get this right. So I'm hopeful that he'll look to this council, but I think at his core, he's going to be his own guy. And I think if you look at how he tries to play his style of management, whether that's been in business or in government, he believes in the theory of chaos, that you try to upset the apple cart to get a better result. So I think it's important that people understand that kind of brinkmanship and not get caught up in what he says or how he goes about it, but realize what his intent is to do, which is to try to throw everything up in the air and see if it lands somewhat better. So I think the bigger question for all of us is not so much his insiders, but how people like Zelensky, how your the head of your government, your prime minister, Donald Tusk, reacts, is that they realize that don't fall for the chaos, but keep strong and lobbying Trump for what you believe is the right policy. And for us, obviously, that policy is to continue strong. And I apologize, not your prime minister, but Poland's prime minister. It's just incumbent upon all of us to keep arguing for advocating for Ukraine winning.
The Wall Street Journal reported about Trump's inner circle plans to end the war in Ukraine. There are some discussions on whether it would be appropriate to, for example, create a demilitarized zone in Ukraine to freeze the conflict and to even deploy European troops, commit European troops to check the implementation of a peace treaty between Ukraine and Russia. My question is for you, John. What does it mean, a demilitarized zone for Ukraine and for this war? And what would it mean if it is the case?
Yeah, I'm not sure it will be the case. That's an article written by the Wall Street Journal based upon a staffer that released some information, not based upon military plans, not based upon the advisors that are going to come in and advise him. The concept of a demilitarized zone doesn't end the war. It simply prolongs the war. We have a demilitarized zone right now in Korea, 75 years later, and it's still active, and it's still a red button issue. It's a trigger away from launching a world war. So it doesn't solve the problem. There was some discussion in there about, yes, a demilitarized zone of 1,200 kilometers with forces being in there. I think the other condition was that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO for an additional 20 years, which is exactly what Putin would want. He doesn't want Ukraine to be in NATO because if he does reset and if he does go in into Ukraine 10 years from now, it will still be in the same position of not supporting a non-NATO country. So it's, in my mind, the frozen conflict solution isn't a solution. It just prolongs the war. And yes, a forever war is the term that Biden has used, but it's still a forever war. So I think what we need to do is get to the point of talking about how we're going to win this war, how we're going to get Putin to leave Ukraine. And then once he has left Ukraine, then we can talk about ceasefires, and then we can talk about demilitarized zones, and we can talk about territories, particularly the Kursk territory going back to Russia, and the Donbass and Crimea going back to Ukraine. But I think we're way in front of ourselves with this Wall Street Journal article, and it just causes more confusion, I believe, than it provides any answers.
And Mark, what is your take on that, on this possibility of this concept of a frozen conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think it's a bit foolhardy for people to go there because, in my mind, something that John often reminds me of, it's critical not to mirror image your own views onto a conflict. The idea that this conflict can be frozen, I think, is something that the West may consider, but it's not what Putin is up to. Ukraine is simply one approach that Putin has taken in his war against the West and trying to reestablish his empire. His first moves, obviously, were into Chechnya and Georgia, and then in Ukraine in 2014, then back in 2022 in Ukraine. And so his thinking of this as a frozen conflict is just not going to happen. He's going to view it maybe as a pause, as a strategic pause for him to reset his economy, reset his military, and gain, some time and space. But it's not going to be a frozen conflict in his mind. So I think for those in the West that are advocating for this along the lines of what was articulated in the Wall Street Journal are chasing fool's gold.
And Mark, I have another question for you. What is your take on the possibility of Donald Trump use military aid as a bargaining chip to force Ukraine to negotiate with Russia? Can he just say, start negotiations with Russia unless you will not receive another aid package?
It's certainly possible. I think the question of whether or not he withholds aid, it's just going to depend on who those advisors are around him and how they particularly, how they come down to the particulars of what they think they can do to negotiate with Putin. I think Trump, though, is in for a surprise. Putin is not going to just roll over. Again, it's going to be incumbent upon Trump to understand what Putin wants out of this. He clearly needs a pause. He's having to rely on North Korean troops to simply try and get his own territory back in Kursk. I would hope that if Trump is a good poker player, he'd understand that the West has some cards here and that he doesn't need to be the one that's going to Putin offering to concede everything, but instead is looking for concessions from Putin. And if you look to Trump's style of management and business, he's often trying to get the other side to lose more than he gives. So if he stays true to that modus operandi, he should be looking for Putin to lose more than what he's willing to give him. And hopefully he gets that, and that he doesn't start just kind of arbitrarily demanding that he's going to, or insisting that he's going to withhold aid from Ukraine. But time will tell. John can probably answer that a little bit better than I can on the military side of that aid.
Sure, John. Could you please tell us about the military aspect of this?
And let me just add one point. And the point being this, and we've talked about this in a number of articles that we've written, but the two conflicts are interrelated. They're interwoven. There isn't, a Ukraine-Russia war without the support of Iran, okay? And Iran being involved in the Middle East and threatening Israel, okay? So I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, President Trump stepped up and said, my full weight's behind Israel, and they can do whatever they need to do to take care of the Iranian problem. I wish we would hear that same type of rhetoric coming out in support of Ukraine, saying Ukraine can do whatever they need to do to solve the Russia problem. Russia's a terrorist organization. And I think we need to get there. I think we need to understand, I think the Trump administration needs to understand that they're interwoven and that they are connected, okay? And by defeating Russia in Ukraine, I think leads to the defeat of Iran in the Middle East and leads to a number of issues worldwide gradually going away. We can see this in the Sahel region in Africa. We see it in the Balkans. We see it in the Baltics. Ukraine, we see Putin's fingerprints everywhere. And I think the way to solve the Putin problem is to defeat Russia and Ukraine, and it takes care of itself. And I wish and I hope that the Trump administration grasps that fairly simple concept.
And Mark, what does Vladimir Putin feel right now after the US general election? What is your take on that? Is he happy about the outcome of this election?
Yeah, I think from his standpoint, and again, John and I probably feel a little differently than most. I think Putin is a guy that wants to cause discord first and foremost. So yes, from a preferred outcome standpoint, based on the public statements that Trump has made versus what the Biden-Harris administration has been doing, he's probably happier that they won, but he's probably happiest at the discord that he's caused, that the U.S. as a result is so divided. So I think as he looks out at this, certainly he's going to think that he can take advantage of advantage of Trump, and he certainly will try. But whether or not that gets done and whether or not Trump succumbs to that remains to be seen. I hope that it doesn't. I hope that Putin overplays his hand, pushes Trump too hard, and Trump reverts to form and says, oh, hell, you're not going to do that to me, and then goes all in terms of supporting Ukraine. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. John, do you have any other thoughts on that? Because I know this is something we've written extensively about, where we've tried to caution people that Russia is out to divide the West. And he's going to do that with whoever's in office, not just Trump, not just Biden.
That's true. He creates division, and that's the purpose of the FSB there, is to create as much division as possible. So they support both sides. So when a Democrat says he's supporting Republicans say, no, he's supporting both sides. He's stirring the pot to get everyone at each other's throats. And he's been successful, as you see some of the rhetoric that came out of the political candidates and their supporters throughout the election process. What's important now is for the Trump administration to bring the country together. Okay, and he's going to need the assistance of the Biden administration to help that process work. And I certainly hope that the Trump administration and the Biden administration can get together and start talking about solutions in Ukraine and stop talking about ceasefires in demilitarized zones.
Thank you, Colonel Sweet and Mark Toth, for your time and for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Hey, thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel. And for those watching in Ukraine, stay strong. This fight's not over. It's still just beginning, and we're behind you. Thank you.